Sergei Sergeyevich Prokofiev was born on April 27, 1891 in a rural estate in Sansovka. His father, also named Sergei, was an agriculturalist originally from Moscow. His mother Maria was from a serf family in St. Petersburg, who was taught theater and arts from an early age. Sergei heard his mother playing the works of Chopin and Beethoven on the piano as a child. He would write his first piano piece at age 5, as well as his first opera at age 9. He would also begin playing chess around this time, which would become a lifelong passion. Maria planned for Sergei to study piano and composition under Alexander Goldenweiser, but she wasn't able to arrange it. He would instead study under Reinhold Glier at the Sansovka estate during the summer of 1902. Sergei began experimenting with dissonance and unusual time signatures in a series of short piano pieces, which he called ditties. However, his parents were initially hesitant letting their son begin a music career. After meeting with St. Petersburg Conservatory director Alexander Glazunov in 1904, Glazunov asked to see Sergei's music. He was so impressed with what he saw that he urged Maria to enroll her son in the conservatory, which Sergei would do after passing his introductory tests. Sergei was much younger than his classmates, who thought he was eccentric and arrogant. Apparently, Sergei would keep notes on his classmates' mistakes. Some of his teachers at the conservatory included Alexander Winkler, Anatoly Lyadov, Nikolai Cherepnin, and Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. He would also meet composer Nikolai Miaskovsky, the two of them becoming lifelong friends. Although Prokofiev developed a reputation as a musical rebel, he was praised for his original works, which he performed on piano. He would graduate from his composition class in 1909 with mediocre grades, but would continue studying at the conservatory under Cherepnin and Anna Yesipova. A year later, Prokofiev's father died, causing his financial support to suffer. He had to begin making a name for himself outside of the conservatory. Prokofiev made an appearance at the St. Petersburg Evenings of Contemporary Music, presenting his more avant-garde pieces, including his 4 etudes. The organizers of the SPECM were impressed with Prokofiev, who invited him to give the Russian premiere of Arnold Schoenberg's Dry Klavierstücke. In 1911, musicologist Alexander Osovsky wrote a letter to publisher P. Jurgensen, who offered Prokofiev a publishing contract. Prokofiev then wrote his first 2 piano concerti in 1912 and 1913 respectively. The second concerto caused a scandal at the premiere, with some audience members shouting out during the performance. Other pieces written around this time include Sarcasms, his first 2 piano sonatas, and The Ugly Duckling. Prokofiev then traveled to London and Paris in 1913, where he first encountered Sergei Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. He would make contact with Diaghilev, who commissioned him to write his first ballet, Alla and Loli. But once the piece was presented to Diaghilev, he rejected it for being, quote, non-Russian. Diaghilev then commissioned Prokofiev to write Shu in 1915, persuading the composer to use folk tales collected by Alexander Afanasyev. The ballet wouldn't premiere for 6 years, but it would be a huge success. Igor Stravinsky would call it, quote, the single piece of modern music he could listen to with pleasure. Prokofiev would eventually rewrite the ballet, however. Prokofiev returned to the St. Petersburg Conservatory to study organ in order to avoid conscription. Luckily for him, 1917 proved to be a very productive year. He wrote The Gambler based on Dostoevsky's novel of the same name. Unfortunately, the rehearsals didn't go well, and the premiere had to be cancelled due to the February Revolution. The piece wouldn't premiere for another 12 years. Prokofiev would also write his first symphony, commonly known as the Classical Symphony, in addition to his first violin concerto. The following year, Prokofiev wrote his cantata Seven They Are Seven, which he wrote while staying with his mother in the spa town of Kislovodsk. The cantata premiered in Paris, conducted by Sergei Kouzavitsky. After writing the cantata, according to Prokofiev's diary entries at the time, he had nothing to do and time went slowly. Prokofiev believed Russia had, quote, no use for music at the moment, deciding to move to the US until the situation in Russia had resolved. With official permission from Anatoly Lunacharsky, the People's Commissar for Education, Prokofiev left for the US in May of 1918, arriving in San Francisco 3 months later. Upon arriving in the US, Prokofiev was quickly compared to other Russian exiles, one of which being Sergei Rachmaninoff.
I don't care who the IRS sends, I am not paying taxes.
Prokofiev would receive a contract from the director of the Chicago Opera Association, Cleofonte Campanini, for his opera The Love of Three Oranges, but the premiere was postponed due to Campanini's death. This furthered Prokofiev's unfortunate luck in the genre of opera, which would cost him his solo career in the US. Financial difficulties led to him moving to Paris in 1920, not wanting to return to Russia as a failure. Prokofiev would reconnect with Diaghilev in Paris and complete some of his unfinished works, one of which being his third piano concerto. The Love for Three Oranges eventually premiered in Chicago in 1921, which Prokofiev himself conducted. Diaghilev showed interest in the opera and considered it for a possible ballet production after Prokofiev played the vocal score for him. On the other hand, Stravinsky refused to listen to more than one act and told Prokofiev he was wasting his time writing operas. Prokofiev responded by saying Stravinsky was, quote, in no position to lay down a general artistic direction, since he is himself not immune to error. Stravinsky, according to Prokofiev, became so irate at his response that the two of them almost got into a fight, quote, "Our relations became strained, and for several years, Stravinsky's attitude towards me was critical." In 1922, Prokofiev moved in with his mother in the Bavarian village of Ettel. While there, he worked on his next opera, The Fiery Angel, based on the novel by Valery Brusov, but it wouldn't premiere until after his death. Prokofiev's popularity in the Soviet Union began to grow. He received invitations to return to the country, but ultimately decided to stay in the West. In the meantime, he married Spanish soprano Lena Ubera while in Germany. They had two sons named Sviatoslav and Oleg. Several of Prokofiev's works were performed in Paris, including a second symphony written in 1925. It was met with lukewarm reception, causing him to believe he was, quote, "evidently no longer a sensation." He would also be introduced to Christian Science, believing his teachings were beneficial to his health. According to biographer Simon Morrison, the composer remained faithful for the rest of his life. In 1926, Prokofiev was commissioned by Diaghilev to write Le Pas d'Acier, a ballet which portrays the industrialization of the Soviet Union. It was enthusiastically received by Parisian audiences and critics. Additionally, Prokofiev and Stravinsky eventually restored their relationship, with Stravinsky considering Prokofiev the second greatest Russian composer, after himself, of course. Prokofiev made his first tour of the Soviet Union in 1927, spending time in Moscow and Leningrad. The Love for Three Oranges was premiered at the Mariinsky Theater to great success. He then wrote his third symphony in 1928, which was broadly based on The Fiery Angel. Koussevitzky, who conducted the premiere, called it, quote, "the greatest symphony since Tchaikovsky's Sixth." It was around this time when Prokofiev began turning away from expressionism, preferring a simpler style he believed was more sincere than the modern music of the 1920s. In 1929, Prokofiev wrote his last Diaghilev ballet, The Prodigal Son, choreographed by George Balanchine. However, Prokofiev didn't like Balanchine's choreography and refused to pay him royalties. In the last scene of the ballet, Diaghilev would say Prokofiev had, quote, "never been more clear, more simple, more melodious, and more tender." Diaghilev died 3 months after the premiere of the ballet. While Prokofiev was driving back from vacation with his family, he got into a car crash and pulled muscles in his left hand as the car turned over. This left him unable to perform in Moscow, but he was able to attend performances of his music. He attended an audition at the Bolshoi Theater for Le Pas d'Acier, where he was interrogated by members of the Russian Association of Proletarian Musicians. They asked Prokofiev about the political message of the piece, which Prokofiev responded, quote, "that concerns politics, not music, and therefore I won't answer." The RAPM condemned the ballet as a, quote, "flat and vulgar anti-Soviet anecdote, a counter-revolutionary composition bordering on fascism," which led the Bolshoi Theater to cancel the production. After Prokofiev's left hand healed, he went on a successful tour of the US in 1930, led by his earlier success in Europe. A year later, he wrote his first post-Diaghilev ballet, On the Dnieper, commissioned by dancer Sergei, who had played the title role in The Prodigal Son. Prokofiev then wrote his last two piano concerti in 1931 and 1932 respectively. The fourth was commissioned by pianist Paul Wittgenstein and was composed entirely for the left hand. Other pieces written around this time include his Fourth Symphony, Symphonic Song, and Sonata for Two Violins. As the Great Depression hit Europe and the US, it halted productions of Prokofiev's new ballets and operas. His piano pieces, however, were largely unaffected. He resented the time lost to his piano performances, seeing himself as a composer first. After the RAPM was dissolved in 1932, Prokofiev increasingly served as a musical ambassador between the West and the East. His premieres received increasing support from the Soviet government, one of which being a score to the 1934 film Lieutenant Kijé. A suite from the film premiered in Paris the following year. The Kirov Theater commissioned Prokofiev to write his ballet Romeo and Juliet in 1936. However, the theater's director Sergei Radlov resigned, causing the production to move to the Bolshoi Theater instead. As many of you probably know, the original script to Romeo and Juliet has a tragic ending. Prokofiev changed the ending to a happy one, until Soviet authorities stepped in and demanded the composer restore Shakespeare's original ending. In addition, the production was postponed with Platon Kerzhentsev, chairman of the Committee on Arts Affairs, ordered the replacement of the Bolshoi Theater staff. Prokofiev then moved to Moscow permanently in 1936, after living between Moscow and Paris for 4 years. That same year, he wrote Peter and the Wolf for the Central Children's Theater, directed by Natalia Satz. She would also persuade Prokofiev to write songs for children, which were eventually published as 3 children's songs. In 1937, he wrote the 10-moving cantata for the 20th anniversary of the October Revolution, but the piece was blocked by Kerzhentsev and wouldn't be performed for another 30 years. Prokofiev's first Soviet opera, Semyon Kotko, was intended to be directed and produced by Vsevolod Meyerhold, but the premiere was also postponed after Meyerhold was arrested and shot by the NKVD. Other pieces written around this time include Zdravitsa for Stalin's 60th birthday and the score to Alexander Nevsky, which was later adapted into a cantata. In 1938, Prokofiev met poet Mira Mendelssohn at a resort, which Mendelssohn described as love at first sight. The two began taking walks with each other and discussed music and literature. Mendelssohn in particular found Prokofiev elegant and charming. They promised to meet again in the following year and to remain in contact. During this time, Prokofiev gave her a signed photo of himself, a bit narcissistic, but okay, and Mendelssohn wrote him a poem for his birthday. Mendelssohn, by the way, was 24 years Prokofiev's junior. At least he didn't marry his cousin. Lena naturally had her suspicions about the relationship between her husband and Mendelssohn. In an interview, she said she initially thought Mendelssohn was, quote, just some girl who wants me to read her bad poetry. Prokofiev told his wife that Mendelssohn was just helping him with libretti for potential operas. By 1939, the relationship between Prokofiev and Mendelssohn became a topic of gossip within the Soviet musical scene. The rumors of their relationship were eventually confirmed to Lena by an acquaintance, but she felt powerless to stop her husband. When Prokofiev finally told his wife about the affair, she said she wouldn't object to it as long as the two of them didn't live together. Prokofiev then began premiering in public with Mendelssohn, including the premiere of Semyon Kotko in 1940. Lena was also in attendance for the premiere, which led to an uncomfortable scene between the three of them. Prokofiev and Mendelssohn collaborated on the opera Betrothal in a Monastery in 1941, based on the libretto by Richard Brinsley Sheridan. Prokofiev would eventually tell Lena that their marriage was over and moved in with Mendelssohn in Moscow, but would continue supporting his estranged wife and their two sons. From 1939 to 1944, Prokofiev wrote his 6th through 8th piano sonatas, collectively referred to today as the War Sonatas. The 7th and 8th sonatas were both win Stalin prizes. In 1940, Romeo and Juliet was finally staged by the Kirov Ballet. Despite the dancers struggling with the piece's syncopated rhythms and nearly boycotting the production, the ballet was an instant success, becoming a crowning achievement of Soviet dramatic ballet. Prokofiev then considered writing an opera on Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. Following the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Prokofiev and several artists were evacuated to Tbilisi, Georgia. The country, not the state. He tried to convince his estranged wife and their sons to accompany him as evacuees, but Lena refused. While in Tbilisi, Prokofiev began writing War and Peace, as well as his second string quartet. He played excerpts of the opera for the Bolshoi Theater, with Soviet authorities influencing him to revise it heavily. The Soviet government's restrictions on music were loosened during the war, letting Prokofiev compose generally how he wanted. Some pieces that resulted from this were his first violin sonata and the year 1941. Prokofiev then joined film director Sergei Eisenstein in the city of Alma-Ata, Kazakhstan in 1943, where he wrote the score to Ivan the Terrible and his ballet Cinderella. The following year, Prokofiev wrote his 5th symphony and conducted its premiere at the Moscow Conservatory, marking the height of his popularity as a leading Soviet composer. In early 1945, Prokofiev suffered a concussion after fainting in his apartment from high blood pressure. Composer Dmitry Kabalevsky visited him in the hospital, believing he was going to die. Fortunately, Prokofiev lived, but never fully recovered and began writing less. Despite this, he wrote his 6th symphony and his 9th piano sonata in 1947. Prokofiev would attend a ceremony at the Kremlin in 1948 where he received the People's Artist of the RSFSR. Literally the next day, Central Committee Secretary Andrei Zhdanov dropped the Zhdanov Doctrine, which was followed by a 3-day conference with over 70 musicians. Prokofiev was accused by composer Victor Belly of, quote, artistic snobbishness. Prokofiev didn't give a speech during the conference, which caused some to take his silence as him being intentionally uncooperative. Allegedly, Prokofiev didn't even attend the first day of the conference, and arrived poorly dressed on day 2. According to writer Ilya Ehrenberg, who was not present at the conference, Prokofiev fell asleep, woke up suddenly, and loudly asked who Zhdanov was. He was even overheard chatting with the person next to him when a senior official ordered him to be quiet. Prokofiev responded by not knowing who the official was. The official stated that his name didn't matter, but warned the composer to listen to him. Prokofiev responded again by saying, quote, I never pay attention to comments from people who haven't been introduced to me. This interaction was confirmed by the head of the Union of Soviet Composers, Tikhon Khrushchev, who stated the official Prokofiev was talking to was Stalinist Matvei Shkiryatsov, chairman of the Party Control Commission. Eventually, Prokofiev and 5 other composers were denounced as formalists, leading to 8 of his works being banned. He would also take on 180,000 rubles in debt. In 1947, Prokofiev filed a petition in court to begin divorce proceedings. The court rejected on the grounds that the marriage was invalid since it had taken place in Germany and wasn't registered with Soviet authorities. After a second court upheld the decision, Prokofiev and Mendelssohn got married in 1948. That same year, Lena was arrested and charged with espionage. She was sentenced to 20 years in a gulag, but with the help of Khrushchev and composer Dmitry Shostakovich, she only served 8. Lena would eventually leave the Soviet Union and died in London in 1989. As for Prokofiev, due to being denounced by Zhdanov, his latest opera projects became attempts at pleasing Soviet cultural authorities. His last ballet, The Story of a Real Man, will be cancelled by the Kirov Theater. Prokofiev began withdrawing from public life, devoting his time to composing. However, after suffering a stroke in 1949, his doctors ordered him to limit his composing to only an hour a day. Despite this, he wrote his cello sonata that same year for Mstislav Rostropovich. Other pieces written around this time include Symphonia Concertante, which was dedicated to Rostropovich, The Tale of the Stone Flower, and his 7th Symphony, his last completed work. On March 5, 1953, Sergei Prokofiev died in his Moscow apartment from a hypertensive crisis, usually attributed to a cerebral hemorrhage. He infamously died on the exact same day as Joseph Stalin, causing his death to be vastly overshadowed. a leading Soviet musical periodical, only briefly mentioned Prokofiev. The first 115 pages were dedicated to Stalin. Prokofiev's apartment was near the Red Square, and when large crowds gathered to mourn Stalin, the composer's funeral couldn't be held at the headquarters of the Union of Soviet Composers. Because of this, Prokofiev's coffin was carried by hand through back streets in the opposite direction of Stalin's crowds. Around 30 people attended Prokofiev's funeral, including Shostakovich, despite the two of them not getting along when they first met. Prokofiev's wife Mira died of a heart attack in 1968 and is buried next to her husband at Novodevichy Cemetery. Prokofiev was noted for his original harmony. While he largely adhered to diatonicism, he also made use of dissonance and cluster chords. Soviet musicologist Igor Sposobin would coin the term Prokofiev dominant, or a combination of the dominant and major seventh, which was often substituted in place of a conventional 5-1 progression. Prokofiev would additionally make use of linear programs in his music. His rhythms are notable for their motoric quality, which often require considerable technical skill to perform. Prokofiev's orchestration is known for its powerful sounds, use of dissonant brass and winds, and complex polyphony in the strings. He was devoted to his method of composing, and often reused music, including rewriting a previous cello concerto into Sinfonia Concertante. He would also take sections of his larger pieces and make suites out of them. These suites were often performed more than the full pieces. Prokofiev's relationship with other composers were quite mixed, to say the least. We already went into detail about his relationship with Stravinsky, but his son Sviatoslav would say of his father's relationship with Rachmaninoff, quote, "They had a perfectly civil relationship, but they each disliked the other's music, and ironically, they both treated each other with a touch of condescension." As mentioned before, Prokofiev and Shostakovich didn't get along when they first met. Prokofiev was initially skeptical of Shostakovich, especially before World War II, and would harshly criticize his music. Kabalevsky would say of this criticism, quote, "After the first performance of Shostakovich's piano quintet, Prokofiev, in the presence of the composer, sharply criticized his work, which he clearly did not like, and at the same time attacked everyone who praised it." Fortunately, their relationship became more amicable, and Shostakovich would praise Prokofiev upon his death, comparing him to the likes of Borodin and Tchaikovsky. American musicologist Richard Cheruskin would call Prokofiev gifted and, quote, "virtually unparalleled among 20th century composers for writing distinctly original diatonic melodies." Due to Cold War hostilities, Prokofiev's reputation in the West suffered, and he didn't achieve the same level of admiration as Stravinsky or Schoenberg. Despite this, Prokofiev is still one of the most performed composers of the 20th century. In the Donetsk Oblast in Ukraine, a music academy and an airport were named after him. Other interesting facts about Prokofiev include him holding a win over world chess champion Jose Raul Capablanca, as well as receiving a Google Doodle in 2011.